Hello and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Professor Ugur Ungor, author of Paramilitarism, Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State, published by Oxford University Press, September 2nd, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing a book on this subject?
Well, I got a research grant in the year 2014 from the Dutch Research Council, which was a project in which you have to appoint two PhD students. And it was a larger project in which I thought it would be interesting to do a comparative study of paramilitarism in different countries. And the two PhD students then one of them worked on Turkey in the 1990s, and the other one worked on Serbia or Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And so part of this project, you have to write a monograph at the end of it. It's a 5-year project. So I finished the project, I did the research, finished the project. The PhD students finished their own projects, and so we have basically three studies. One of them is my monograph, and the other ones are the case studies. So that's basically how the project developed. And then I got the idea when I was doing, back in 2009, a postdoc at the University College Dublin at the Center for War Studies. Over there, Professor Robert Gerhardt, he ran a project which was on paramilitarism in the aftermath of the First World War. It was on the Freikorps and on some of these militias that emerged in the aftermath of defeat, especially in Austro-Hungary and in Germany, but also in the Ottoman Empire and in the Russian Empire that had crumbled by then. And so back then, I kind of had the idea, or I started reading about paramilitary groups and about pro-state militias and these type of groups, and then I realized there's no one overview book. And so really because of the fact that there's a gap. I mean, there are studies on Indonesia and on Latin American countries and on Yugoslavia specifically, or on Chechnya, but there was no one book that kind of covered broader ground than just the case studies. So because of this gap, I basically decided to write it.
So I see from the book description, it mentions Sudan, Colombia, Belfast, Kurdistan. Can you tell me what regions you cover and sort of what time periods also we're looking at? Yeah,
so this book is mostly a conceptual and a theoretical book. And it uses case studies from around the world. So some of the places mentioned on the book cover are included, but then there are others. So for example, in the broad introduction, or the introductory chapter, really the chapter 2, which is titled Paramilitarism's Long 20th Century. I basically start in the early modern period, really, with some of the Italian condottieri, and then I go through the 19th century, the Ottoman experience, the kind of the Balkans, paramilitarism in the Balkans. And then I really slow down with the 20th century, because I think it's interesting to look at how paramilitarism as a phenomenon became a modern phenomenon in the 20th and 21st century. And so that includes, obviously, examples from Germany, from Yugoslavia, from, of course, Ireland. I look a little bit into China. Interwar China is really interesting. Of course, you get these different cliques who are fighting on behalf of one or the other state. It's more like a confederation of warlords. And of course, Latin America, which most of the paramilitarism is. When we think about paramilitarism in Latin America, we think about the 1970s. But really, there are deeper historical roots going back to the 1930s. And then basically, I take it in the post-war era, paramilitary groups on the U.S. side of the Cold War, on the Soviet side of the Cold War, which was the main driving force, really. A little bit on the global south, Latin America, Central Africa. So in Indonesia, and especially 1965, that's been a very important period. And then I look at post-Cold War Europe, Armenia, so the Nagorno-Karabakh War, Chechnya, basically anywhere where I can find some decent materials, where the scholarship is somewhat developed. I have examples from it. In some cases are very well developed in one aspect of paramilitarism, such as organized crime. In other cases, there are great studies on the relationship between the militias and the state. Mm-hmm. So basically where the literature takes you.
So, when you're listing all these different countries, the thing that comes to mind is how can one term paramilitarism cover what I would imagine are very different sort of organizations because of culture or maybe the political systems that they're working in. Can you sort of define paramilitarism, how it's used for this study?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that this was really one of the major challenges. How can we explain that paramilitarism has emerged in culturally, technologically, politically very different societies? And here we basically looked, or I looked in this book at the key issue of the relationship between the state and the paramilitaries on the ground. So first and foremost, I define paramilitaries as armed groups that are fighting for or on behalf of a state. So I exclude groups that fight against the state that are very often covered under the study of rebels, or non-state armed groups, as they call them sometimes. So I look really at those who fight for the status quo, for the state, and then of course you see a broad variety of cases from Colombia all the way up to China and Indonesia. But I've always been interested in, let's say, three elements really. I looked at three dimensions of these very different cases. One is the relationship between the state and these paramilitaries. Second, the relationship between organized crime or criminalization and these paramilitaries, these militias. And number three, I looked at the violence that these paramilitaries committed. If you look at these three things, you see a variety, but you also see, if you're open-minded to this kind of comparative analysis, you also find some uniformity, or you find similarities. And to the best of my abilities, I try to look at those similarities while not disregarding the very real differences, of course, that exist.
Let me ask you about the second one, organized crime and paramilitaries. You say they're armed groups that fight for a state, and then, how does organized crime get involved in that?
Yes. This is one of the, really, it was, for me, to be honest, one of the most difficult things to study. So crime is basically, it's as old as humankind, basically. There are different forms of crime across centuries, across continents. But as diverse as it is, it basically has two essential features. It is covert, and it relies on private violence. And these two elements of crime, organized crime, can come in very handy for states when they are interested in, or for certain regimes or governments that are interested in setting up paramilitary groups, because it allows them a form of cover and plausible deniability of distancing socially, politically distancing mechanisms that they otherwise can't do, really. So in each and every country-specific case, organized crime was very heavily involved in either as a cause of paramilitarism. So these militias were often recruited from the organized crime milieu. Best example is and has always been Arkan, the infamous Serbian mafia boss who turned into a paramilitary warlord during the Yugoslav War of Succession and Dissolution. Really interesting. Here you have a guy who's on the search list for Interpol, who's wanted for bank robbery, for grand larceny, for the violent crimes, property crimes, smuggling of drugs, human trafficking, or any and all types of crimes you can come up with. And so he's on a top wanted list in like 3-4 European countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Italy. And this mob boss, all of a sudden, in the late 80s, let's say 1989, he disappears from Western Europe. He all of a sudden appears in Belgrade, and he's hanging out with some of the political top brass. And that's this is a paradox. How is it possible that a man like this, who in essence his activities are against the state, in that he becomes co-opted by certain political actors, very powerful political actors, and then becomes, and then a year later, all of a sudden he appears in Bosnia and Herzegovina or in Croatia, and he's burning villages, and he's committing ethnic cleansing, and all types of massacres and other war crimes.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Ugur Ungor, author of Paramilitarism, Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State. You can find more information about his work on his Twitter feed, Ugur Umit Ungor, spelled UGURUMIT If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit WarScholar.org or MilitaryHistoryPodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at FullContactNerd.com and TechnologyInSpace.com. Now back to the podcast. So speaking of that, so what you just described, it also seems to me, I often think of paramilitarism as requiring people who have sort of a, and not to be, not making a political judgment, but have sort of a criminal streak to them, a bit of brutality, a bit of willing to break the rules. How often do most of these paramilitary groups that you've studied, are they linked to authoritarian regimes most of the time or all the time?
This was one of the things that puzzled me actually when I started the research, right? So to what extent are these type of paramilitary groups that are recruited from the demi-monde and they operate in this shadowy space, but let's say be under the state, but actually really beyond state institutions? To what extent is this is this kind of a regular thing or an irregular thing for particular regimes?
Mm-hmm.
But then the interesting thing is then, you look at democratic, or at least, let's say, nominally democratic regimes and governments, such as Colombia, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s. You look at Turkey in the 1990s, then really we need to realize that there seems to be really no correlation between regime type and paramilitarism or co-optation or organized crime.
Mm-hmm.
So authoritarian regimes do not all create paramilitary groups. Some of them are actually pretty happy with their police, their army, and their intelligence agencies
mm-hmm.
as the three major pillars of coercive force. And on the other hand, we would say that democracies, of course, they have accountability,
mm-hmm.
They have transparency, and even for in ordinary democracies, when a police fires even one bullet, and there's an investigation,
mm-hmm.
and there's a full accounting actually of this act of violence. So you would say that democracies don't set up these kind of murky, 50, 60 men strong militias that operate in the shadows and that target, for example, political opposition figures, or they go into ethnic cleansing of indigenous groups, for example, or of ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm.
One would argue that, but this is one of the surprises for me too, is that in both authoritarian regimes and in democracies, it is much more important to look at kind of the patrimonialism, so the kind of strong personal relations between certain politicians, heads of agencies, and these powerful, strong men that later become paramilitaries.
Mm-hmm. Those
personal ties, they're much more important really than whether a regime is overly authoritarian or more democratic.
That's kind of a, how should I put it, scary statement. What would you say among the paramilitary groups you found or studied, which were you most surprised used paramilitaries for whatever reason?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think that if we let's say have a bias against authoritarian regimes,
mm-hmm.
as in they're violent anyway and they're brutal thugs, etc., then maybe I'm most surprised by the fact that the type of paramilitaries that I look at were in some regimes not used at all. So, for example, you take the Soviet Union under Stalinism, a deeply violent regime,
mm-hmm.
but a deeply violent regime that ran most of its violence through its formal institutions. So either the army, or the police, or the NKVD, which later became the KGB.
Mm-hmm.
which ran a prison system, the Gulag, mass executions and things like that. But paramilitary groups were not really involved. You don't get these thuggish groups of men who have personal ties to Stalin, and Stalin then threatens even his colleagues in the Politburo with them. That never happened, and that's maybe a surprising case. Mm-hmm. A case in which it was absent, let's say, but a case in which it was present. I do think that, for example, Indonesia is a very interesting case in that regard. So you have the 1965 the coup d'etat and the genocide, in which roughly 600,000 communists and alleged communists are executed and are dumped in mass graves or in rivers. And what is interesting is that Indonesia, despite having a very strong army, and because of the coup d'etat even becoming a militaristic authoritarian regime, with a clear authoritarian leader like Suharto, and a very strong army structure, a very loyal army also that didn't fragment and politicize. Despite that, they used all these militias as proxies to carry out all these killings. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a little surprising for me. Why use these people? Why you have perfectly functioning army? Why not run it through the army?
So it sounds like as far as training, organization, weapons, that sort of thing, all these groups, it sounds like it was, as you said, about 50 men, probably tied together by, personal, cultural, maybe family ties, lightly armed, just kind of maybe it sounds like they just have like one head, maybe one or two leaders who, sort of charismatic leaders. Is that a fair way to describe these groups you looked at?
I think so. I think a lot of these groups, if you take a look at their internal structure and their genesis, their development, and also sometimes their demise and their kind of disbandment, then you roughly see that. You see kind of charismatic leadership. You see either regional, class, or family ties, or ethno-religious ties. And you see, in some cases, they can be, of course, many. They can be thousands. But if you break that down, like beyond the kind of nominal perspective of, for example, the Tigers in Serbia, or the Janjaweed in Darfur, for example, or the kind of these type of death squads in Argentina in the 1970s. Then if you look under it, then there's always a kind of core group of roughly 40, 50, 60 men who are tied to a particular leader, almost in a type of almost as an organized crime family, really. Mm-hmm. Personal loyalty, very clear personal loyalty, and taking orders from those leaders, and ultimately also very dependent on the strategy that these leaders point out for themselves. Mm-hmm. So rather than a much kind of broader, almost abstract way of thinking about paramilitaries, you also have to look at it from this perspective. When you break it down, you zoom into these groups, then you always see people like that. And I offer a couple of vignettes also of these very kind of rambunctious and deeply violent men.
Have you found situations where any of these groups fought outside of the country, for military objectives or maybe some other reason outside of where they were based?
Few. There are, I think, a very few number, a kind of small number of paramilitary groups who fought outside of the country. Very often it was a kind of domestic conflict. Mm-hmm. And it was, of course, a little easier to hide them also domestically through distancing, through these type of distancing mechanisms. There are maybe one or two, like the Janjaweed, maybe were involved briefly in the Central African Republic, maybe, but not much. Maybe some of Gaddafi's militias were roaming around Central Africa, but their major tasks were always domestic, almost always domestic. Yeah, that's the interesting, and it's also, I think that's also telling in itself. The fact that these are mostly used for domestic purposes, it means that this is primarily political. This is about the balance of power inside the society, rather than kind of a form of shadow diplomacy or dirty tricks that these regimes play externally. Mm-hmm. There are, of course, a couple of maybe examples that don't entirely fit. So, for example, the United States has used some of these militias in Afghanistan, right? Like Uzbek militias, for example, ethnic or other forms of personalized militias. You might say, okay, these are American mercenaries, or these are American proxy paramilitary groups. You could argue that, and some colleagues have argued that, and I think that's fairly legitimate to say that. On the other hand, these are also internal Afghan dynamics. And these groups, they don't travel across the border to go and fight somewhere else. They have maybe financial interests, and they have business interests, and they invest in some other countries. But their violence is primarily domestic.
What about them makes you label them paramilitary versus, say, police or para-law enforcement or something like that? Where does the military part really come in? That's
also, I think, a terrific question really to think about, because in principle, some of these groups, of course, they've been involved in a number of conflicts, or they've committed violence that you might argue are kind of para-police, such as swarming neighborhoods, such as arresting, kidnapping, and killing or forcibly disappearing like particular individuals from a political opposition. Right? So these are really almost like the intelligence agencies work, and they're not really, let's say, paramilitary, I would say. But I think that the paramilitary, the military aspect comes when we're dealing with very often an insurgency, such as in Colombia, I think was a perfect example. Right? We have the FARC, of course, that was a major insurgency for decades, really. And in order to, or the example of the conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurdish PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. These are insurgencies that develop because we have a lack of democratic space in these societies to incorporate these forms of these rebel groups as political groups. I mean, had there been the democratic space, then the FARC would have been a political party, they would have been in parliament, etc. And the same for the Kurdish political parties in Turkey. But because this space was unavailable or wasn't allowed wasn't tolerated, they became like violent insurgencies that sustained themselves with various sources. And in these insurgencies, in both of these cases and in other cases, when the insurgency was too much of a threat to the central state, or it was very difficult to root it out through conventional means, namely through military strategy run by the army or by the gendarmerie, then some of these regimes, like groups of politicians, cartels really, they resorted to these paramilitary groups outside of the law, operating outside of the law, masked, armed, sent out to these villages to assault not these armed groups themselves, but really the civilian base of these armed groups. So you see these paramilitary groups in Colombia, for example, massacring villages that were suspected of supporting the FARC. Or the Turkish paramilitary groups that burnt villages, forcibly disappeared and killed people, mass executed them because they were, supposedly or allegedly helping out the PKK. I think in the context of that type of armed conflict, of course, it's a low-intensity armed conflict. You see that these type of groups, they operate under the table, and not with like military objectives, but really with paramilitary objectives, which is looking at the committing violence against the civilians that surround a conflict like this.
How often did you find in the different studies that the members of these paramilitary groups were either former military or police, or were actually also military and police at the same time and also secretly doing paramilitary work?
That is a major, one of the major common threads really that runs throughout all of these cases is that we look at the profiles of these men. Yeah, there are a number of, let's say, criminals or professional criminals among them, but most often actually there are people who are not necessarily in the security forces anymore of whatever type. Yeah, so police, special police, gendarmerie, army, etc., or territorial army or whatever. But those who were sidelines, or discharged, or retired, people not in it, but people gravitating around these formal security forces. Right. So, for example, you have, of course, the Phoenix program. This is the CIA campaign to eliminate the Viet Cong, kind of similar to Condor, the Operation Condor in Latin America, or Gladio in Europe. there was a paramilitary group called the Provincial Reconnaissance Units, the PRU. These people were authorized to kill, to torture, and to detain suspected communists in southern Vietnam. And most of the members, if you look at these members, some of them have written their memoirs, actually. And you see, actually, there were former Vietnamese soldiers or former security personnel who were disgruntled and who kind of gave up because they thought this war wasn't winnable. But in this case, anti-communism, and especially the fact that they were allowed like new spaces to commit violence. Right? So before, guys, trying to fight the Viet Cong doesn't work. They're too strong. They're beating us. But now, actually, you can assault the civilians as well. So the suspected civilians that normally would have maybe some form of due process, or there's legal boundaries to the violence. When the boundaries are eliminated, then these men actually very often came back into action, and because of the fact that they were very often radicalized or brutalized in their previous careers, they very often became kind of very fanatical members of these paramilitary groups.
So you kind of already answered a question I wanted to ask, but I'll see if maybe there's more to the answer, which is, were any of these groups developed before an insurgency started for whatever reason, and then because they were created, inspired an insurgency of some kind?
I think that's also absolutely one of the key issues. These are really terrific questions. I think both of these elements exist. I think to some extent you have groups that were, let's say, there were inchoate, active groups that were really on retainer. And these groups, they existed, and these heads of state, they could use them if they wanted to. But they really became galvanized and mobilized when the insurgency really took off. But it's also the fact that these insurgencies, take the Chechen case, for example. And you have basically two Chechen civil wars. Wars, basically, the first war is 1996, 94 to 96. And you have, of course, a conventional war against the Russian army, which the Chechen rebels, the insurgency basically loses. And then in 1999, you have another insurgency that lasts for about, let's say, 7 years. And there's some skirmishes at the tail end of it until 2009. And if you look at the way that the first war was fought, mostly with the Russian army, fairly regular run-of-the-mill war, really. And it was asymmetrical because the Chechens were outnumbered and outgunned. But nevertheless, we didn't see the type of paramilitary groups, type of ruthless escalation of violence that we saw in the second Chechen war, where you saw these fighters called kontraktniki, the kind of contract fighters, who were these tough guys hanging out at the gyms in Moscow, and they would get together, be armed, and they would get license to kill, send them off to these villages in Chechnya, and they committed some horrific atrocities there. As well as local Chechen, we shouldn't forget that either, like pro-Russian Chechen paramilitaries, those who basically thought this second insurgency is nonsense, it's not going to bring us anything, and most of the fighters have now been hardened Islamists, so let's fight against these people. And of course, they got wide fiats, license to bear arms, really wide licenses by the Russian government. And then you saw these particular groups that gravitated around its leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, who was still the president of Chechnya, interestingly, but who started off as one of these paramilitary bosses. Right. It was also somebody, by the way, who had a personal history in crime, in organized crime, and he had committed a murder before he was boss of the paramilitary groups. In which the rebels even went to the family of the victim and kind of pleaded not to take revenge against his family. But this goes to show that the level of brutality and the level of paramilitarization that the second Chechen war saw, the first Chechen war hasn't really witnessed that. It's the dynamic of the conflict that's also very much responsible for an escalation of these groups, or at least, let me put it this way, of if there were, let's say, pro-state militias before, such as in Northern Ireland, you had loyalists. You had, to some extent, even armed loyalists who would defend Ulster to the last man, etc. But then during the war, they became really galvanized, really armed, better trained, more brutalized also, and also developed forms of collusion with the state, with the British government or British government agencies that wasn't possible before, in the 70s. But by the 80s, already that's a major thing. So the dynamic of the conflict definitely drives paramilitarism as well.
So I know So as you said, these groups sort of exist in the shadows, operate in the shadows on behalf of the state. But how often do you find that they had sort of a notoriety, or actually not notoriety, sort of a popular following among people, whether they knew their identities or not? You know, how often did you see them as sort of treated as heroes by certain elements of the state or the societies they were in?
Yes, that's I think a very real. It's a very let's say productive way of looking at paramilitarism as well, because we can't just say these are these kind of elements from the edges of society, these kind of peripheral, marginal people that are banded together by the state and then sent off to this to some imagined enemy. Mm-hmm. No, they also very often they come from particular communities where they're considered as heroes, committing violence for the good cause. Mm-hmm. Or at least very often committing violence that, it's unfortunate that we have to do this, but it's necessary for the continuity of the state. Or it's necessary to defend the enemies of Serbia or whatever, these type of kind of nationalist concepts as well. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a prehistory of this, right? I mean, in his classic study, Bandits, Hobsbawm, he defined these social bandits as the type of outlaws who the state regards as criminals, but who remain within society considered by their own people as heroes, mm-hmm. as champions, or like avengers, fighters for justice. Mm-hmm. Sometimes even leaders of liberation, these types of things. So social banditry, in that book, I think still is very much valid, has a social base, whether that is in like 2 or 3 villages in northern Serbia where a lot of paramilitaries disproportionately were taken from or recruited from, interestingly. In some cases, there were cousins as well. There's a Serbian paramilitary group that was in eastern Bosnia, and of the paramilitary group, like a fifth of them had the same last name. So this matters. These are cousins and brothers going out, literally band of brothers, going out and wreaking havoc. So I think this is very important actually to look at. The cultural specter of social banditry among these paramilitaries really made people like Arkan, to stay within the Serbian example, really made them look like heroes who championed the poor, and not as violent, predatory, acquisitive groups who oppress also poor, poor peasants or poor urbanites. Mm-hmm. So, but this is partly because the kind of ordinary folks. They idolize these groups. They lionize them. And on the other hand, of course, they are also, in the context of that conflict, portrayed sometimes by the media or sometimes by political groups as heroes, by particular political parties, for example. They can often do that. And heroism can be a very powerful motivator for a lot of people. Mm-hmm.
I'm speaking with Ugur Ungor, author of Paramilitarism, Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State. You can find more information about his work on his Twitter feed, Ugur Umit Ungor, spelled UGURUMIT If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit WarScholar.org or MilitaryHistoryPodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyinspace.com. Now back to the podcast. So it sounds like, and this is maybe just self-evident, but most of the victims of these paramilitaries would have been the poor. I can't imagine a situation where anyone in the elites of the state or any privileged would become victims. Maybe 1 or 2, political opponents, but in mass killings, I imagine it was poor communities that suffered the most.
That is, I think overall that's correct. Whether it is like Colombian paramilitaries assaulting communities that were suspected of working with the FARC, for example, in the north of Colombia, right on the ocean side, there are a number of indigenous groups that were almost entirely wiped out by these paramilitary groups that were ethnically cleansed these areas. But at the same time, if you look at some paramilitary groups who were who were active, like pro-state paramilitaries, then like in Ivory Coast, for example, then you see that it's also some of the critical intellectuals in society were also assaulted. So, or in Argentina, you would see that, for example, paramilitary death squads, especially. You saw that they went after university professors and lawyers and doctors who were critical, journalists, members of parliament who were critical of this policy of this escalating policy of counterinsurgency against the communist rebel groups. There were a large number of people who thought, okay, we understand that we have a counterinsurgency, but to expand that violence towards civilians who may or may not support that insurgency is unacceptable. And so a lot of those people were also assaulted by paramilitaries. For example, the Colombian paramilitaries or the Mexican paramilitaries, for example, who of course sometimes overlap directly with the cartels. They are very, very violent towards journalists, for example, Mexican journalists or Colombian journalists in the 1990s. A lot of them were assassinated by paramilitaries because they obviously are searching for those shadowy links between the state and the paramilitaries.
And I assume when you're using the word assaulted, you're including both intimidated, beaten, and then maybe even killed.
Yeah. Absolutely. The violence, so I have one chapter on the organization of paramilitarism, and there's a section in it which is on the violence specifically, because, you can't talk about paramilitaries without talking about violence, of course. So, and you see a kind of wide variety of violence that they use against their victims. And that can be forced disappearances, be open massacres in the villages where these people live. There can be threats sometimes. There is the case of that Serbian paramilitary Arkan, who once beat up an academic historian for writing a book in which Arkan was portrayed as a warlord. Right? So imagine you write a book and then the guy visits you and then beats you up in your house. This actually happened to this person. It's absolutely terrible. You have a wide range of violence, like torture, for example, sexual violence. There's incarceration, for example, extrajudicial incarceration, extrajudicial executions, and there are a number of massacres, including, for example, the Srebrenica massacre, July 1995 in eastern Bosnia, in which members of the Serb paramilitary group, the Scorpions, and a number of other paramilitary groups executed about 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men. That massacre was not run through the Bosnian Serb army, but it was run through the paramilitaries.
So thinking about the fact that these paramilitary groups are protected by the state, so it's sort of a two-part question. They can almost commit their violence with impunity. One, how much danger would these groups be in the various case studies? And two, why didn't you have just people flocking to groups that, if you wanted to fight the enemy and you can join a group with no rules and be allowed to kill with impunity? I would imagine certain types of people flocking to try to join these groups.
Yeah, and in some cases that also happened, or at least there was an attempt of some of these people who tried to flock to these groups. But there, of course, you have the on the one hand, you have paramilitary groups that were kind of self-engendered, so self-selecting, right? So the moment that one or more of these governments, for example, gave the impression to their population that, hey, we need people to help out win this war, or to win this conflict, then definitely a number of men got together and they banded together with very little training and very little discipline, went into these sometimes in the battlefields or into these villages where the civilians of the enemy group lived, and they committed some pretty bad violence against these people. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, it was really without the space that the state opened up to these groups, it was absolutely impossible for them to gain this much influence, to get all these weapons, to get training, and to get these wide carte blanche of violence, of being allowed to commit violence against these civilian groups. So You had a load of paramilitaries. For example, in the war in Yugoslavia, you had a number of paramilitaries who showed up at the front that were totally useless, or they were called weekend warriors. People would just during the weekend would go to the front with their military gear, take a couple of selfies with some photos with the guys, and then get drunk, maybe kill some people, maybe burn some villages, and then come back. But that's not a very reliable source for the state, because in a lot of these operations, you need very sensitive operations. You need to have a reliable base of people who also can keep secrecy, for example. And secrecy is absolutely key, I think, in paramilitary activities. If you can't keep secrecy, then you also lose deniability.
And as far as the danger to these groups, it seems like mostly, except where they might have been in more hot spots in war zones, it seems that it's kind of safe for them to go out and do their business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without the kind of the war zone and the way that the state would allow violence to be committed in the war zone, these paramilitary groups couldn't really show up. At the same time, we also have to realize, I mean, in any situation of war, as a civilian, you can't just walk to the front and start engaging in like military zones that are totally prohibited and off limits for civilians. You start taking photos there, or you start, or you're armed there, etc. You can even be treated as an enemy combatant. So, without the knowledge of the state, or at least particular individuals and powerful elements within the state, there's no way that these groups could have been so powerful and committed all this violence. And I think that this is where, especially the intelligence agencies, in particular like military intelligence agencies, have been really, really important, because military secrets, they're probably the most sensitive secrets of any state. And in the cases that I've studied, it's especially individuals who were involved in the military intelligence, like the powerful bosses of the military intelligence, that were really, really influential in setting up these groups.
How many cases did you come across where maybe the state had achieved its goals, and maybe it felt it was time to put an end to whatever paramilitary group it was using, basically retire them? Do you have many cases like that, and do you have any situations where paramilitary groups might have resisted that?
Definitely, there are. In essence, when their tasks are done, right, when these violent acts have been consummated, basically, these groups, they're very often they're either reined in or they are deactivated. They're not entirely disbanded yet, but deactivated or put back in on retainer. And sometimes the conflict flares up again, and then they're reactivated again. So, and these processes of deactivation or demobilization is probably one of the most difficult things, actually. So you saw this already in the Freikorps, really, at the end of the First World War, when the German state and the Austrian also state was, at least they tolerated some of these paramilitary groups with a nod and a wink. They kind of tacitly condoned some of their actions because they were great German patriots, etc. But then after a while, they started posing a problem for public order, for example, right? Or they started fighting violently with the police, right, who didn't want to be disarmed. So the problem of blowback is a major problem in almost all of these paramilitary groups. And if you'd have to advise, policy advice to a state that's about to embark on these paramilitary adventures, you actually want to advise them to not do it, or at least to have an exit strategy. Because there are two examples, and one example that's really telling of a failed demobilization, which is in Serbia, really. In Serbia, they created so many paramilitary groups in the early 90s that in the second half of the 1990s, from 95 on, when the war ends, 95, 96, Belgrade is a very chaotic city. There's a lot of these former paramilitaries that have now branched out into organized crime, with kind of killing each other for turf wars, etc., things like that. And when these militias themselves when the Serbian state made an attempt in the late 90s and in the early 2000s to disband the groups, or at least to try to integrate them into the regular armed forces, then there was very serious blowback against them, right? So Zoran Djindjic was the former prime minister of Serbia. He started in 2001, and then in 2003, in March 2003, he was assassinated by one of these former paramilitaries because they refused to be demobilized, because he was not only going to demobilize them, he was also going to look at the war crimes that were committed and maybe send them to the Yugoslavia Tribunal in The Hague. So, those are paths not taken, and those doors are closed. Once you start this and you sign, you put your signature onto those crimes, then you have a problem, because then later these guys can also turn against you. And there are also examples, for example, from Iraq. I mean, the most recent fight against ISIS, for example, was run by paramilitary groups. The Iraqi state allowed it, and maybe needed it also to fight against ISIS. But now, of course, they refuse to disarm. Because it's, on the one hand, they're arguing, well, we fought the ISIS war for you. Why would we disarm? We are the heroes of this conflict. And second, they've, of course, made incredible tentacles into the economy of that society of Iraq, in that they refuse to take, to basically simply hand over their AK-47s and go back being a baker or being a blacksmith or these type of things. They don't want to do that.
I guess the state has to maintain its level of violence high enough that the groups that it empowers don't overtake it in time.
Definitely. You saw this also. In Syria. One last example is very interesting. In 2011, when the demonstrations began in Syria, they were repressed not with the vast coercive apparatus that the Syrian government had and still has, namely the intelligence agencies, the special forces, the army, and the police, but they actually set up these militias who, partly sectarian and partly super loyal to Assad, who went into the streets and massacred the demonstrators. And then gradually they seized so much power, these people, that so when the Syrian army or the Syrian police went to disarm these groups and to disband them, as the guys, thanks for your service, now it's time to turn over power, then these militias refused. And starting from 2016 on, you saw skirmishes even between the Syrian army and these Syrian paramilitaries. And then what do then? You basically, there's no other way to disarm them, because you were also touching upon, these paramilitaries, they come from constituencies that are super loyal to Assad. So if you arrest the paramilitaries, you also lose those constituencies. So it's a real catch-22 for a regime that sets up paramilitary groups. It's very difficult to rein them in again.
It's almost like you're creating a sort of a new political dynamic. It's not just a law enforcement or military dynamic. You're giving people political power that maybe they didn't enjoy before. It's interesting.
Absolutely. And you might even say that it's a form of social class formation. So these new groups, they become kind of a class, a social class, an economic class, and a political class in themselves. And they become a new reality in that society.
And so this question, I don't want it to sound like flippant or something, or just, but which group did you come across that was the most violent or destructive?
That is an interesting one. I think that maybe the Syrian groups, actually, to be honest, because as I said, in the 2011 uprising against the Assad government, the Assad regime set up these militias, sent them on these communities, and basically gave them carte blanche to do as they wish. And the violence that these militias committed were so disproportionate and so brutal, from sexual violence and massacres to killing of children and infants, for example. This violence was so brutal that it really polarized the victim communities and really turned the dynamic of what would have been some mass demonstrations that could have been resolved in a different way. It turned it into a fully fledged civil war. And then they didn't just stop there, these militias, but they, after a while, after having, let's say, cleaned out opposition territory of civilians, repressing people, there's a lot of predatory, like rent-seeking. And starting from 2018 on, when Assad basically effectively had won the war, these groups, they turned their weapons to loyalist areas. So they started to kind of kidnap, for example, children of like pro-Assad businessmen for ransom, or they started putting up checkpoints between loyalist villages where there was absolutely no need to have checkpoints. But of course, the checkpoint you can, you obviously, you can make a lot of money on checkpoints by getting a lot of kickbacks and bribes. And so these things, they're ultimately not only there's destroyed opposition civilian communities, but also loyalist communities. So they're that destructive, and they're firmly in power. These people right now in Syria. There's no way that they can be unseated right now. I think it's going to be very, very difficult, and they're ultimately also a headache, not only for kind of global order or for the international regime of human rights or the rule of law, these type of things, but they're ultimately also a headache case for President Assad.
How much is the idea of paramilitaries, the concept and sort of their use, connected to globalism? Is it that, I imagine that states always used violence however they needed to control their population, but it feels like with, United Nations and countries watching each other and it seems that states would be more, it would be more necessary for states to use these shadowy groups. Can you comment on that?
Definitely. I think that one of the reasons that these paramilitary groups have emerged is because of international human rights monitoring. I mean, there's a reason why throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, paramilitarism becomes more and more sophisticated. So these regimes that use these type of groups, they get better and better in hiding and masking these type of groups. Obviously because they always want to disavow any linkages with these shadowy organizations by claiming, these are private groups and they commit violence on their own volition. So this deniability, which is key, is absolutely, key issue in all paramilitarism, is necessary for domestic reasons, right? So the electorate, if they find out that you've been doing these things, obviously you'll be punished at the ballot, or for the institutions, you can't just do whatever you want, but also for international reasons. So the threat of foreign intervention, monitoring by human rights NGOs, the United Nations commissions that show up and they want to see what's going on here, international criminal tribunals. I mean, the European Union was a big deal, for example, in trying and prosecuting Serbian paramilitaries. Sanctions, for example, and sanction busting to circumvent embargoes. All these things, these globalist norms and developments, they were a major effect on or challenges to regimes that wanted to set up paramilitary groups. It became more and more difficult, but also the challenges became then to hide and to mask and to camouflage these groups better and better, to the extent that the former Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, with the Janjaweed militias that destroyed most of Darfur, or President Assad of Syria, they have been exceptionally sneaky, really, and very, very shrewd in hiding these type of groups and distancing themselves from them. They're also watching these trials against Milosevic, thinking, okay, how are they going to tie this guy to these militias? I think that there's a kind of global learning process there as well.
So what resources did you and the others involved with this book use for your research?
Yeah, this is one of the most difficult things, actually. So I get students, for example, who show up and they say, well, Professor Ungor, I would love to study some paramilitary groups. How do I start? And I tell, well, it's not that easy. As in, you really have to kind of develop new methodologies of how to approach and study these processes. So you have to work, for example, with leaks or with kind of protected or anonymous sources. Interviews with victims or with survivors are extremely important because they have seen these militias at their worst hour, and they've seen these militias do things that the government that employed these militias wants to deny, or interested in suppressing that knowledge, for example. And so I think that we need to, you can't just walk up to a paramilitary group and say, hey guys, I'm an anthropologist and I'm interested in studying how you guys develop your culture of masculinity, for example. I mean, that's just not a realistic way of approaching, these groups. because you will, I mean, at worst, you will be victim of violence yourself, and at best, they will probably laugh at you or kick you out. Although there's some really interesting exceptions of people who miraculously, for one or the other way, have gotten access, maybe through patients or close personal relations, of building up rapport with these groups that have made it, and I find that very admirable. But mostly, we're looking at, for example, court cases, cases in which, for example, a tribunal has been able to get access to confidential and classified documents from that state. This is what the Yugoslavia tribunal did, for example. They had access to the Serbian Interior Ministry archive. So they managed to get a lot of very interesting documents out, none of which were a smoking gun. But the whole point was, of course, not to have a smoking gun. So, but through a kind of circumstantial evidence and kind of circling around the question, one can actually construct a picture of paramilitarism.
So what did you find, what did you come across, either your own research or the other research, that most surprised you?
What I thought was maybe most surprising, that's an interesting one. No, I think maybe I found it kind of surprising that, maybe paradoxical or something, that in the foreign policy of the United States, that paramilitarism played such an important role. So, for example, in Latin America, Operation Condor, it meant really a paramilitarization of several societies, including Colombia. Some of these paramilitaries were trained in the U.S. or by the U.S., always in covert ways, by the way, almost always in covert ways, in ways in which, for example, the Reagan administration could always say, well, this is not our problem. We're also against these massacres, against the workers of the Chiquita banana plants by paramilitaries. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any control over them. But the interesting thing is, of course, now we have the National Security Archive, which is freely available. You can just go and research this stuff, and you see how shrewd actually the system was set up. And that's only Latin America. I mean, Indonesia in 1965 is a terrific example as well. And of course, in Europe, there's always been rumors of Gladio, the secretive organization that was nurtured as a part of U.S. foreign policy against a potential communist invasion. And these were supposed to stay behind paramilitaries fighting against the communist occupier. I have found very little evidence, let's say, that this was an exceptionally influential scheme, but there are some very good indications, especially from Italy, from Germany, and from Turkey especially, that are, but I think, believable. And I think that was interestingly surprising for such a superpower like the U.S. to then resort to the kind of paramilitary staff section, which even existed in the CIA, starting from the 1950s on. That was a little bit surprising to me.
Did you come across any situations where paramilitary groups were used to stage attacks that were to be blamed on the enemy? Sort of false flags operations, I think they're called.
There are a few examples of these, but I've only found a few, to be honest. So you see that sometimes in Northern Ireland, when basically in Northern Ireland you had two major loyalist paramilitary groups. You had the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and you had the UDA, the Ulster Defense Association. Both of these were battling against the IRA, I mean, also interesting in itself. I mean, if the UK, the British Army and the British intelligence and British police security forces are so well trained, and they're top of the line, hyper modern security personnel, and why do they need these tattooed thugs with their pumped up muscles and their weapons, right, in Northern Ireland? That's a separate question. But what happened is that these two groups, the UDA and the UVF, yes, they hated the IRA, and they fought against the IRA, and they committed a lot of violence against both combatants, members, and non-members of the IRA, so Catholic civilians. But also they had conflicts with each other. And when they had conflicts with each other, when a member of one group or the other group was kidnapped and killed, for example, because of turf wars or because of some kind of personal slights or insults or whatever, humiliations, then they would very often dress the whole violence up actually as an IRA hit job. So they would commit violence against these people like the IRA would, for example, generally do. So that, for example, was a false flag operation very clearly. And ultimately, if there were any false flag operations, they're also set up in such a way as not to be uncovered. So it's very difficult without like proper access to these, mostly intelligence files or Interior Ministry archives or paramilitaries who, for example, speak frankly on the record about these things. Without any of these sources, we can't really know for sure.
Mm-hmm. So I know that obviously there's a lot of information you can't access or get to, but was there a particular, say, question or issue among all these cases that you would have really liked to get an answer to for whatever reason? Oh, yeah. There are quite a few, actually. Actually, I would have loved to, because of the categorical nature of his denials. Slobodan Milosevic, who throughout 5 wars of paramilitary destruction in Bosnia, he denied that his government, as the Serbian government, had anything to do with these groups. They asked him about Arkan, and he just said, "I don't know the guy. He's a bad guy, but never heard about him." Nonsense, of course. He was totally funding them, arming them. They were secretly meeting sometimes. Now we know from kind of defected officials. But I would have loved to have seen, for example, those minutes during which a head of state like Milosevic would sit down with a thug like Arkan. I mean, what would they even talk about? That would have been a very interesting, I think, and also very insightful event. The second, maybe final example here is one of the things, let's say one of the major events that uncovered the Turkish system of paramilitarism in the 1990s was a car crash that happened in November 1996. And there was a Mercedes, one of the Mercedes 600 class, tinted windows, black Mercedes. It crashed into a truck in an accident, one of the traffic accidents that happened a lot in Turkey in those years. And there were 4 passengers in the Mercedes. 3 of them died. 1 of them survived. Now, the interesting thing was, who were these people who were in the car? So the sole survivor was a member of parliament for the party in the government coalition, and at the same time he was chief of a tribe, of a Kurdish tribe in the southeast. At the same time, head of his paramilitary organization. The other 3 people who died were really interesting. One of them was the head of the Turkish police in Istanbul, and the other one was the top mob boss since the 1970s, a guy called Abdullah Çatlı. Also, Çatlı's girlfriend was in the car, right? So what are these people doing in the car together? And what we found out, or what lots of decades of research really found out, is that this was really a knot in this paramilitary entanglement in which basically the Turkish government, represented by the head of police and the member of parliament, they outsourced paramilitary violence to these mob bosses, who then would mobilize people to go and commit violence against Kurdish civilians in the southeast. This has been called the Susurluk scandal, after the town of Susurluk in western Turkey where it happened. And I would have loved to have, for example, have any details or information about what these people were doing in the car, and where were they going, and what type of conversations were they having. And these things would have been really interesting, but unfortunately, subsequent Turkish governments have not been able to shine any light and bring full transparency and accountability to this paramilitary entanglement. Yeah. One of the most unfortunate things about paramilitarism, apart from the actual violence, is that the fact that so many governments use them, I think, creates sort of a global cynicism, not among everyone, but, large numbers of people, develop a cynicism that all governments are engaged in shadowy use of violence. And, the more you uncover, it seems like, who's innocent in all this, not to condone it, but, I think that's one of the problems there. So I don't know. I don't know if you have any comments, but that's just something I noted.
Definitely. I think that beyond cynicism, there's also the fact that the public, whether it's Colombians or Yugoslavs or people in Turkey or in Chechnya, they see these things happening. They see this terrible violence happening, and they develop not only cynicism, but also a sense of obscurantism, in that it is impossible to know what's really going on. Mm-hmm. There's no point searching for the truth, because the truth won't come out anyway. So they kind of start almost to normalize this type of violence and these paramilitary relations. Mm-hmm. And I think that type of kind of moral abandonment or moral defeat, I think is also a major problem, because then you basically lose, indeed, as you say, become cynical, and you give up even on pursuing the truth about these groups.
And then I think that attitude can also lead to the creation of other violent groups based on this anger and confusion and all these things combined. So I think it kind of feeds itself in a vicious cycle.
It can become a vicious cycle, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you see that right now in the streets in the United States, where some of these militias are, let's say, overly friendly with the police. Mm-hmm. And you might have to argue, doesn't the police have to disarm these people and send them home? Because that's where the collusion really starts. I would be very interested to hear more about, or to learn more about how certain police forces, for example, in Philadelphia or in Wisconsin, how they, let's say, are friendly towards some of these militias, or they tolerate them various ways. Mm-hmm. And this is where you kind of, when the government or when a state institution like the police, that's supposed to be impartial, when they start taking sides mm-hmm. in these conflicts in the streets, that's when we're really in dangerous ground, I think, unfortunately.
Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
Not really. I think I think there was a lot of interest in this in the topic. The paramilitarism was relevant in, let's say, several societies, and was still globally also relevant when I finished the book. But I think it will be, what I try to do with this book is to build a bridge between these case study experts, this specific literature on Latin America or Indonesia or other countries, and to get a conversation going between the different colleagues. Mm-hmm. And this is maybe not the first book that does it. And there are other books like Ariel Ahram, for example, Proxy Warriors, terrific book also. We also tried that, but I try to take it a little bit further, and to develop that conversation, to create that space where we can have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. So what's your next either writing or editing project?
Well, it's actually on paramilitaries again, but I'll tell you why. This book has 3 major chapters. One is like the long history of paramilitarism in the 20th century, a chapter on organized crime, and a chapter on the organization of paramilitarism. And because this was relatively abstract, or relatively conceptual, theoretical, I wanted to include a chapter originally, which was a case study of the Syrian paramilitaries that I just mentioned to you. But that research got kind of out of hand. It spun out of control. I kind of collected lots of material. I did lots of interviews with eyewitnesses and victims, but also with paramilitaries themselves. We managed to talk to these people on Skype, on Facebook. I even met some of these people in person, mm-hmm. And collected a really interesting kind of body of knowledge on the motives, the violence that these guys committed, and the way that they reflect back on this period, in the past decade, let's say, in Syria. And that was so initially supposed to be only a chapter, but it grew in size, and I got more and more engrossed into the topic as well. Is that now I'm making a spin-off book, which is supposed to be is provisionally called Assad's Militias and Mass Violence in Syria, in which we look much more empirically in the example of Syria of exactly how these militias have functioned and how they have fared in the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Where can people find you on the web? Do you have social media or web page or anything like that?
Yes, you can go to ungor.nl, ungor.nl. I also have a Twitter feed. You can also look at that every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And the Twitter name?
The Twitter name is Ugur Umit Ungor. So my first, my middle, and my last name. Okay. I think if you search on Twitter on my name, then you'll basically find it.
And I'll spell that for listeners. It's
Yeah, so Ugur Umit and then Ungor. That's my last name.
Okay. All right. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Well, thank you for doing this interview. It's been a pleasure actually to speak to you. And I hope maybe when I'm done with the Syria book, I'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this was really interesting. Thank you very much for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options as well to get great military history information. You can find links to interesting military history videos on my Facebook page, WarScholar. You can find links to interesting military history news articles, military history archaeology information, and academic information on my Twitter page, WarScholar. You can find photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez WarScholar. You can find my military history videos on my YouTube page, WarScholar 1945. You can also sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new military history books being published. Thank you for listening.